Alright, so today we're going to go over Chapter 10, Dose Limits for Exposure to Ionizing Radiation. There's a lot of information on regulatory agencies and agencies that make just recommendations, but there are some other significant things that we're going to cover with this. The effective dose limiting system based on risks of cancer and genetic effects to tissues or organs exposed to radiation. So different parts of the body will be a little bit more sensitive to the effects of radiation, as we kind of covered earlier in some of the other chapters. As you know, bone is not so much going to react to regular just radiation as opposed to something that's a little bit more sensitive that has a higher cell division rate, like the cryptic cells in the stomach, gonadal cells, stem cells. All those have a much greater chance of reacting to radiation. Radiation-induced malignancy, cancerous neoplasm caused by exposure to ionizing radiation. Now, at the regular diagnostic range, you won't have too much or hardly any chance at all of being exposed or having any types of malignancies occur from that, just because of the dose ranges. When you get more into radiation therapy and the higher dose ranges, then it has more of a potential to cause harm. We have four major organizations. These are for protection standards. They're all pretty much around. ICRP is just the International Commission on Radiologic Protection. NCRP almost sounds the same, National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. UNSCEAR is commonly called the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, so that deals mostly with the nuclear effects. National Academy of Sciences National Research Committee on the Biologic Effects of Ionizing Radiation, another agency you may hear of. ICRP in 1928 was formed, international authority regarding the safe use of sources of ionizing radiation, mainly just basic X-ray machines at that time, dealing with occupational and public dose limits, only makes recommendations, not an enforcement agency. So they put out these pamphlets, and then the regulatory agents are the actual ones that can make enforcements, but they do lots of research. NCRP, 1964, chartered by Congress, reviews recommendations of the ICRP, so what you just heard of from the other committee, published reports based on findings and recommends implementation for U.S. radiation protection criteria. So it's also not an enforcement agency as well, so they pretty much take the information that's kind of given to them, review it, build on that a little bit, and then make recommendations. This is a rather old chart here, even though the radon is still pretty much spot on. What the big difference is, the medical X-rays have gone up quite a bit in terms of overall radiation exposure, not just background or natural occurring radiation. UNSCEAR from 1955. Basically, as you read this, their main goal is to follow the Japanese atomic bomb survivors and probably the Chernobyl ones as well, and then more recently the Fukushima disaster, also in Japan. They kind of follow those patients along, see what their prognosis is from when they get exposed and what their long-term effects could be, including types of cancers. This group, the NAS, NRC Bayer, another advisory group, reviews studies of biological effects of ionizing radiation and risk assessment. Basically follows risks of groups of people who were routinely or accidentally exposed to ionizing radiation, early radiation workers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, evacuees from Chernobyl. So very similar to what we just covered with UNSCEAR. These are the regulatory agencies. These are actually agencies that can do something and enact laws and actually make changes. The NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Agreement States, EPA, Food and Drug Administration, Occupational Safe and Health Administration. You've probably all heard of these at one point or another, but we'll cover each of them. NRC deals with atomic energy in the interest of national security. So there has to be kind of an overseeing group that kind of looks over this and what could happen for certain things like nuclear meltdowns, wartime activities with nuclear bombs being dropped. They want to make sure that they're aware of potential and long-term effects from using atomic energy. Agreement states assumes the responsibility of enforcing radiation protection regulations through the respective health departments. So with the agreement states, each state has a health department and they kind of work in tandem. If you look in this chart, not so much in tandem, but these agreement states all have basically the same similar types of laws and agree on what minimal standards it should be. If you look at here, the NRC states, and then we also have NRC states that have expressed intent to sign agreements. So some of these states not quite on board yet. It's probably been updated since this PowerPoint slide was created. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, you've all probably heard about this, protects the health of people and for safeguarding the natural environment, facilitates the development and enforcement of regulations pertaining to control or radiation in the environment. So there's definitely a huge responsibility for the EPA to make sure that we're not just dumping things like nuclear waste into the environment because of long-term effects. Those effects also get into the water supply, can affect people in a very, very negative way. This little map here shows EPA map of radon zones. So you basically know, where a lot of radon could be seeping up through the soil as opposed to some certain areas. There is elevation involved in this as well. I'm not sure which 3 areas are the highest or the worst, but it definitely shows you where radon is occurring. FDA, Federal the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, next ongoing products radiation control program, regulating the design and manufacture of electronic products, including diagnostic X-ray equipment. So you would think just food is obviously not part of that, but the Drug Administration, because it is in a hospital setting and it is not therapeutic, but kind of a discovery tool to help doctors, does fall under the guidelines of the FDA. Conducts on-site inspections of X-ray equipment, especially mammography units. Compliance with FDA standards ensures protection of occupational and non-occupational people. So what we'll have is that they will provide inspections and go through this equipment, make sure it's doing the output it's supposed to, make sure it's not going haywire, make sure it's not excessively irradiating more patients than it should. OSHA, you have this in every work environment. Monitoring agency in places of employment, right to know what you're working with, especially hazardous materials. So if there's any type of hazardous materials, OSHA is going to have a sheet on it. Workers have a right to know what they're working with, and could it be hazardous or cancerous, those types of things. Now as we get more specific to radiation, the RSO just stands for Radiation Safety Officer. RSC is just a committee assigned to those day-to-day supervision of the facility's radiation safety program. RSO has quite a few responsibilities that we'll go into in just a minute. RSO is also responsible for monitoring, so they will be in charge of those little charts that you get for your filters, radiation badges. We'll make sure that we're all within our allowable limits. 4 important duties. ID radiation safety problems, so you got to figure out what problems there are within the department. Initiate, recommend, or provide corrective actions. So if someone's being unsafe, they need to make sure that they have some type of punishment system or corrective actions set up in place. Stop unsafe operations involving byproduct material and verify implementation of corrective actions. So it's really much a follow through that. And a lot of times it is a radiologist that gets designated as a radiation safety officer, but there's usually a committee that handles the badges, and then management usually handles the corrective action part of it. 10 also covers effective dose limiting system, which assesses radiation exposure and associated risk of biological effects for radiation workers and the general public. So let's just read each one of those 3 particular areas. Get the general idea of what this limiting system is for. Radiation Control for Health and Safety Act of 1968 deals with equipment performance standards, protects the public from the hazards of unnecessary radiation exposure from electronic products. So not only do you get radiation, obviously, from a radiation machine, but there is some radiation that comes from microwaves, some from TVs. You get radiation from the granite countertops. The building materials in your home have a certain amount of radiation involved with them, so there's quite a bit of exposure, but it adds up to very, very little. And you don't think about the radiation so much these days because it is being monitored by the FDA. Code of Standards for Diagnostic X-ray Equipment just went into effect in 1974. Applies to complete systems and major components manufactured after this date, so pretty much everything, because I don't think there's much equipment from pre-1974. It doesn't regulate the user, only the equipment. So the equipment has to be able to do certain things. It'll only do outputs of certain amounts of kV. If you're in mammography especially, let's have lower amounts of kV. We don't want equipment, some shooting at 100 kV, some shooting at 1,000 kV. So this kind of streamlines that process and gives generally accepted guidelines for each piece of equipment that's sent out there. Consumer Patient Radiation Health and Safety Act of 1981, federal legislation set minimal standards of accreditation of education programs who perform X-ray procedures and certification of such persons. So that deals mainly with the licenses. The main one you know of is the ARRT, which is the national governing body. Safety precautions and standards, no legal penalty for noncompliance, and not all states are the same. So this is a safety act, so there needs to be some sort of training involved, but not every single state has the same amount of training or licensures from one state to the next. Chapter 10 also talks a little bit about tissue weighting factor, which is this is how it's indicated, abbreviated. Indicates the ratio of risk of stochastic effects attributable to radiation of a given organ or tissue to the total risk when the whole body is uniformly irradiated. So if you get some type of radiation to the entire body, what it's going to do is it's going to apply this tissue weighting factor to different parts of the body. So obviously the gonads are going to be more sensitive, so the tissue weighting factor is going to be a little bit higher for that. It's something like bone. Generally, with the mature cells in it, you're not going to alter that too much, so that'll have a lower tissue weighting factor. CED is the cumulative effective dose limit. It's basically 10 millisieverts or 1 rem times your age. So total external plus internal cumulative effective dose. This is going to be your lifetime dose as well. So each year we're going to add that up. But basically 5 rem is the most you can get during 1 year. NCRP recommends 50 millisieverts or 5 rem annual effective occupational dose limit. Lifetime not to exceed age times 10 in millisieverts. So, all of you will be well below that limit unless you leave your badge in a nuclear power plant or something. This chart just shows typical exposure rates or dosages from different types of sources. If you look down here, single chest x-ray, about 0.1 millisieverts. This is about 1 return flight between New York and London. So not very much. And you can use that when we're talking about background equivalent radiation time. Make your patients feel a little bit better. Average UK annual dose from diagnostic medical radiation, about 0.4. So equal to about 4 chest x-rays is what the average person gets on there. US, probably a little bit higher, just because of the amount of doctors and hospitals available and their willingness to use all of those tools that they have. Detectors, you see a lot of these detectors that all completely rip off. A lot of them are a scam job. They'll just pretty much go off any time, so I wouldn't put too much stock in these things to try to get your money. Old PowerPoint, so a little bit more topical towards Easter, which was a little bit ago. Alright, so that covers chapter 10. We'll get into chapter 11 a little bit. This one's a little bit drier, but make sure you know those kind of limits we talked about towards the end. Tissue weighting factor is also important, as well as, what else we cover? Some of the acts, you'll need to know those acts. Consumer safety code of standards, and you kind of know these a little bit better, because occasionally the ARRT will ask questions on that as well. If you have any questions, as always, make sure you just send me an email. Otherwise, just read over that chapter. It describes this stuff pretty well, even though it may be a little bit slow for you.